Ever since Vladimir Putin decided to transform his decade-long campaign of aggression into a full-blown invasion of Ukraine, there's been one question on everybody's lips: who's next? Even as the fighting rages on in Ukraine and Russia experiences military losses at a scale it never anticipated, Putin and his cronies have volleyed threats at anybody and everybody they see as part of the West's attempts to limit Russia. The Baltic states, Poland, Sweden, they've all been threatened before. But now, there may be an answer to the big question. Ukraine was first, Finland is next. At least, that's the impression one will get from a recent article by Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Medvedev, which was published by the Russian news agency TASS on September 8. Medvedev is the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council and a staunch ally of Putin who served as Russia's president between 2008 and 2012, back when Putin pretended to care about Russia's presidential term limitations. Medvedev isn't needed as a puppet president anymore, so he now spends his time saying the things that Putin wants to say so that Putin doesn't have to say them. And on September 8, Medvedev said a lot of things that sounded eerily familiar. In his TASS piece, Medvedev sent a warning to Finland, stating that the main thing that the country should remember is that any fight against Russia could lead to the collapse of Finnish statehood once and for all. That alone isn't out of the ordinary. Russia tells everybody who'll listen that they would lose a war with Russia if one started. However, it's the justifications for making these threats that should make the world pay attention. Obsessed with a thirst for a revanche and determined to reverse the outcome of the Soviet-Finnish confrontation of 1939 to 1940, the leadership of Suomi recklessly plunged into the crucible of war on the side of Nazi Germany in the summer of 1941. Medvedev writes, casting allusions to Finland being a former Nazi ally. He continues, claiming that Helsinki's aggressive appetites were quite in line with a German line during the 1940s. Again, the intent is clear. Medvedev wants to remind the reader that, once upon a time, Finland cooperated with Nazi Germany. It even took part in the devastating siege of Leningrad, all of which is true. However, there is a lot of much needed context missing from Medvedev's statement as he attempts to cast Finland as an aggressive state with Nazi leanings. Putin's mouthpiece doesn't talk much about the war that led Finland into the Nazi embrace, the Russo-Finnish War that raged between November 1939 and March 1940. He makes mention of it and then attempts to rewrite history by claiming that Finland wanted to reverse the outcome of that war in the quote shared earlier. But what Medvedev doesn't share is that it was the Soviet Union that started this war with a nation that would have quite happily stayed out of World War II if it had the option. As the Encyclopedia Britannica points out, the entire conflict with Finland, that Medvedev claims several times revealed the brutal nature of the Finnish people, happened because the former Soviet Union wanted to take control of several pieces of Finnish sovereign territory. Finland said no. Russia launched an invasion. Finland eventually made peace with the Soviet Union via the Treaty of Moscow and was forced to cede land in the process. Its alliance with Nazi Germany came as it attempted to reclaim what was rightfully Finland's. As is often the case with Russian propaganda, some of the facts are there, but many are not. Medvedev, like his ally Putin, is skilled in crafting alternative versions of history that happen to leave out any possible mention of Russia being in the wrong. Medvedev keeps writing, stating that Finland is Russophobic, which is probably right given the history that Russia and Finland share, and that the thirst for profit at the expense of Russia was installed in Finnish minds back in the days of Hitler, which is patently false. Observant viewers may be starting to see an interesting parallel forming here. It's clear that Medvedev is trying to paint Finland as a Nazi nation, one that hasn't evolved from the days of World War II, and a country that's determined to do everything in its power to threaten Mother Russia. The very existence of Finland as a sovereign nation can be cast as a threat to Russia, and that's where everything starts to click into place. Russia made the same claims of Nazism about Ukraine to justify Putin's supposed special military operation, and it keeps making those claims. In February 2023, the BBC fact-checked a speech given by Putin in which Russia's leader repeatedly claimed a neo-Nazi regime had taken root in Ukraine after 2014. That was a lie. Ukraine's last parliamentary election before Putin launched his invasion saw just 2% of the country vote for far-right candidates who could be called Nazi adjacent. It should also be noted that President Vladimir Zelensky is Jewish and members of his family died in the Holocaust, the BBC adds. In September 2024, Al Jazeera reported that Putin once again repeated his Nazi claims, as he said part of his reasoning for invading Ukraine was to protect Russian speakers from a neo-Nazi dictatorship. Again and again, Russia keeps trying to convince the world that Ukraine is a Nazi country akin to Germany during the 1930s up until the end of 1945. The idea is blindingly simple. The world hates Nazis. Putin's reasoning goes, so it will understand if Russia attacks a country as long as he keeps calling them Nazis. And now, through Medvedev, Putin is trying to make the same claims about Finland. This parallel with Ukraine is distressing. Worse yet, the Nazi angle isn't the only parallel that can be drawn about Medvedev's recent comments about Finland. The Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, notes that Medvedev makes several claims of Finland persecuting ethnic Russians in his piece, which are claims Russia has made about Ukraine. He also talks about Finland attempting to sever ties with Russia, as seen in his introduction, where he bemoans the fate of the citizens of Suomi who live near the border with Russia. They used to enjoy hefty benefits from thriving bilateral trading and economic relations, and quite naturally hesitate to express their anger about the stupid policies that the Finnish authorities are pursuing to the detriment of their interests, Medvedev writes. And in these words, another parallel to the things Russia was saying about Ukraine before it invaded. Beyond all of this, there are two words that appear in Medvedev's piece that will sound instantly familiar: root causes. Putin loves to use that nebulous phrase to justify his war in Ukraine. Every time Putin enters conversations surrounding ceasefires or peace in Ukraine, he uses the term root causes and the claim that those root causes haven't been eliminated to avoid declaring peace. Putin did it in mid-August when he met US President Donald Trump in Alaska, and he's been doing it ever since talks about declaring a ceasefire in the war he started became serious. What the root causes are seems to vary depending on who's asked. Ukraine's supposed Nazism may be one of them, which is why Medvedev is trying to draw that parallel with Finland. But the real root cause is likely that Ukraine's continued embrace of Western values threatens Russia because it paves the way for NATO expansion. Several articles have been written about Putin's problem with NATO's expansion deeper into Europe. In October 2022, Ken Moskowitz wrote a piece for the American Foreign Service Association, in which he pondered how much of a role the prospect of NATO expansion had on Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. By 2017, Moskowitz writes, around 69% of Ukrainians supported joining NATO, per a poll conducted by the Democratic Initiatives Foundation. This was a stark turnaround from just 5 years before, when only 28% of Ukrainians expressed support for joining NATO, and it showed Putin that Ukraine was westernizing in a way that made him very uncomfortable. A July 2024 article published by the Australian Institute of International Affairs outright states that NATO expansion explains many of Russia's actions in Ukraine. Tom Switzer writes that the primary reason for the war, or the root cause, as Putin and Medvedev are so fond of saying, was this expansion. Putin may have an imperial impulse, as many commentators claimed at the time. However, his big problem was that NATO eventually becoming an attractive proposition to Ukraine would lead to Russia being encircled by countries that he considers enemies. Switzer notes that many academics have claimed that this expansion amounted to poking the bear. Well, the bear bit back with the Ukraine invasion. Now, which country happens to have joined NATO, bringing the defense collective right to Russia's border? Finland. So long a neutral nation, Finland joined NATO in April 2023, after decades of trying to strike a balance between its ties to the West and its ties to Europe. Medvedev even mentions this in his TASS piece, decrying Finland for giving up a relationship with Russia that was beneficial to both sides, while paradoxically trying to claim that Finland is both depriving itself of the trade inherent to that relationship as it supposedly enriches itself. But through it all, the same complaints Russia made about Ukraine start to appear in its rhetoric about Finland. The country is becoming too westernized. It's also a brutal country with Nazi origins and ongoing Nazi leanings, and it's only Russia that has the courage to stand up and do something about the root causes of the many issues that plague Finland. And just as was the case with Ukraine, Russia may ultimately have to do something about these root causes, threatening Finland's sovereignty in the process. There are so many parallels in Russia's rhetoric here. And according to the ISW, Russia is now using Finland as a convenient scapegoat for all the grievances it has with the West. Medvedev's threat against Finland is not unique, but rather part of an ongoing Kremlin effort to threaten NATO states and justify future Russian aggression, the ISW writes. Russian presidential aide and former Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev similarly claimed on March 13 that Finland tried to exterminate the Slavic population and that the West is again turning Finland into a springboard for aggression against Russia. Before, it was Ukraine that would serve as that springboard. That's why Russia had to invade. Now, with Ukraine embroiled in war and Russia still convinced that it can win, attention is turning to Finland. It shares a border with Russia. It has built closer ties with the West than ever before, thanks to its NATO membership. Finland is even rejecting Russia. So Finland has become a threat, just like Ukraine. Euromaidan Press outright comes out and says that what Medvedev is doing with his TASS piece and what's being seen in Russian media regarding Finland in general is all about creating the conditions where Russia could justify a future war. It also assessed the ISW piece, stating, ISW assessed that the Kremlin is now applying the same disinformation playbook to NATO members, such as Finland and the Baltic states. The think tank emphasized that this shift is part of a broader effort to normalize the idea of conflict with NATO and lay the informational groundwork for escalation. That's the entire point for Putin. He wants to push NATO back. That, perhaps as much as his desire to shatter Ukraine's sovereign status, was the root cause for the special military operation. Now, as Medvedev starts using similar language while drawing parallels between Ukraine and Finland, it seems that the Russian information campaign is starting again. Notably, Medvedev's piece was published by TASS, which is a Russian news agency. Putin wants his people to read that article. He wants them to view Finland as a nation of Nazi collaborators who are a threat to Russia, because creating that illusion will make it easier for Russia to justify its future invasion to its own people, even as the rest of the world decries its actions. Perhaps Medvedev himself puts it best. However, while building a new Mannerheim line in a fit of revanchism, in other words preparing military infrastructure for another aggression against Russia, the main thing for the Finnish establishment is not to forget that confrontation with us could lead to the collapse of Finnish statehood once and for all. No one will be soft-hearted as in 1944 with them anymore, nor will anyone care to read them good bedtime fairy tales about the Moomins. As the saying goes, Sita saa, mitä tila. You get what you order. He's basically telling the Russian people that Finland is asking for a fight. How could Russia be blamed if it gives that fight to Finland? None of this is to say that a Russian invasion of Finland is imminent. Putin would be foolish to order such an invasion while his forces still labor in Ukraine, being killed in their thousands in return for tiny scraps of territory. However, it's clear from the language being used that Russia is laying the groundwork for a war in an eerily similar way to how it did prior to the Ukraine invasion. Which leads to the obvious question: is Finland ready to go to war with Russia? On a purely numbers basis, it isn't, at least if it has to fight that war alone. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, which ranks 145 military nations annually based on several dozen metrics, the only advantage Finland might have over Russia is its geography. Russia is the second most powerful military nation in the world, GFP says, with Finland ranking 48th. Finland's active military contains just 24,000 people, though it has 870,000 reserves due to military training being compulsory in the country. Even so, Russia dwarfs Finland in pure manpower, with 1.32 million active personnel and 2 million reserves. These types of disparities are everywhere. Russia spends about $120 billion more per year on its military. It has 4,129 more aerial assets in its air force, and that's not counting the vast drone army it's built during the war with Ukraine. Russia has thousands more tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery units, even when taking its vast losses in Ukraine into account. And in many ways, Finland is less prepared for a fight than Ukraine for the simple fact that it's a much smaller nation. Of course, these are just numbers, but on paper, Russia should decimate Finland if the two countries go to war. But would it? Even if Finland's military is nowhere near as strong as Russia's, its people are certainly mentally prepared for a fight. That much was revealed in a May article published by The Times, which said that the Finnish word sisu, which roughly translates to grit or resilience in English, has become the byword for the current Finnish attitude. "We believe sisu is our superpower," a senior civil defense planner named Pasi Ratakainen told The Times. "We live in a hostile climate in Finland. We are next to Russia. You need guts." The willingness to defend itself against Russia, morphed by Medvedev into acclaimed Russophobic brutality, also feeds into Finland's mental preparedness for a fight. Over 80% of the Finnish public supports the conscription that ensures so many of its population are trained and can serve as army reserves. And as one official put it for The Times, "We have our history and geography. Every time our neighbour Putin says something, we are reminded. We Finns are not very good at being nervous. It's not natural to us." That seems to be a reflection of the Finnish mentality right now. Don't get scared, get prepared, and preparing is precisely what Finland has been doing, especially in 2025. As UNN reported on August 25, Finland is doing everything that it can to fortify as much of the border that it shares with Russia as possible. Part of those fortifications involves the erection of a 124-mile fence designed to tackle the flood of undocumented immigrants arriving in Finland, courtesy of Russia's hybrid warfare tactics. That's another thing that Medvedev fails to mention in his opinion piece, once again showcasing how Russia tends to whitewash its role in raising tensions while always casting blame on the other side. The decision to build this fence follows action taken in November 2023 to close all border checkpoints. Two of these checkpoints were reopened a month later, though illegal immigrants kept flooding in. By April 2025, the border was closed again, and it will remain that way for as long as Finland feels threatened by Russia. Also in August, Militarily reported that the Finnish Defence Forces are in the process of building an underground fortification system that integrates residential and combat spaces into a large complex. Staying underground can protect the Finns from drones, artillery, and many of the weapons that Russia could bring to bear in a future war. Plus, as Militarily notes, Finland is building these underground defences based on lessons it's learned from the Ukraine war. Finland didn't need to read Medvedev's recent words to understand that Russia is laying the groundwork for an invasion. It already knows, and it's getting ready. Still, none of this would be enough for Finland to be able to defend itself against the full might of the Russian military long enough to eke out a victory. But that's where the root causes problem that Russia likes to talk about comes into play. Putin invaded Ukraine, in part because he was worried about the country joining NATO. In Finland's case, he now has to deal with a country that is part of NATO, and one that, ironically, wouldn't have been were it not for the Ukraine war. As a NATO member, Finland is protected by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, which essentially states that all NATO members will come to the defence of any other member that's attacked on its sovereign soil. That, more than anything that Finland is doing to prepare itself, may ultimately prevent any follow-through on all of the attempts Russia is making to tar Finland with the same brush it used to tar Ukraine. Finland has been very active in its NATO membership too. The Kyiv Post points out that it's allowed NATO to open a new regional land forces command centre in Mikkeli, which is close to the Russian border. Over the past 2 years, it's participated heavily in NATO exercises, all of which Putin has decried as provocations while ignoring the fact that it was Russia's actions that led to Finland's participation in the first place. Medvedev's words show us what Putin is thinking. A future fight with Finland is on the Russian leader's mind, and he's using his favourite mouthpiece to get the justifications in early. However, Finland is ready, due to the unique mentality of its people and the actions it's taken to protect itself through NATO membership since the Ukraine invasion. While Finland is preparing for a fight, Poland is embroiled in one. Earlier in September, Russia launched a massive drone incursion into Poland that is, for all intents and purposes, an attack on a NATO member. Find out what happened next in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of how Europe's NATO members are preparing for the possibility of war with Russia.